This is Science Anatomy, and I'm Mrs. Bolton, and today we're going to talk about the skeletal system. We're going to do a brief overview and talk a little bit about bone structure in part one of my skeletal system series. Okay, so skeletal system, you probably know a little bit about this. Let's talk about functions first. Big function is support. Got to make sure that you are able to hold your frame and to move about. Supports things that are attached to it, like your muscles. Gives a lot of protection to different parts. We have evolved a very nice helmet already on our head that supports and protects our brain, the soft mushy parts. Also, your heart, which is also pretty important for the functioning of your body, is also encased in a nice little cage which protects it. It's a point for muscle attachment. You wouldn't really be able to use your muscles because your muscles are just like little strings that pull on the levers that are your bones. So if you didn't have your bones, it would be very, very difficult to move around and to do movement. It's also a place of mineral storage, and one of the things that you have to be aware of as particularly young women is you got to make sure that you take in enough calcium now, because after menopause, there's no real new bone tissue that's laid down. It's just maintained or subtracted from. So if you don't want to be the poster child for osteoporosis, have a good source of those minerals like calcium now, so that you'll have a good bone mass when you get to be my age. It's also a place of hematopoiesis, which I love that word, because all it's missing is like a U, and it would be like it would have every vowel possible. Hematopoiesis just means it makes red blood cells. That's all. Here's a picture that you're going to have to identify different parts of on your test or a quiz. It's a long bone. There are several different parts here. The ends of bones are called epiphyses. And we're going to start to use some of the terminology you learned from the first chapter that we went over. Proximal means closer to the point of attachment. So this femur here, this is closer to the point of attachment, and then we also have a distal epiphysis. In the middle here, this is called a diaphysis. And there are a variety of different parts here as we go along. We'll talk a little bit about them. Okay. So let's talk about bone structure. Long bone, and the femur is a great example of this. As I said, the epiphysis is the end of the bone. Epiphyses is the plural of that word. It can either be proximal or distal. Proximal if it's closer to the point of attachment, distal if it's farther away from the point of attachment. Usually articular cartilage covers the epiphysis of a long bone, because it's usually going to have to connect with another bone, and you don't want them necessarily grinding bone on bone every time you move those two bones in the joint. So you put a little cartilage there that kind of like smooths things out a little bit. It reduces the grinding from movement. Some people, when they get older, their cartilage at the ends of their bones is greatly reduced and becomes very, very painful for movement, because the cartilage just isn't there to cushion it. The diaphysis is the shaft of the bone. That's the part in between the two ends. And we have some membranes here. The periosteum is a dense fibrous connective tissue covering that covers the entire bone. So it's not like when you see a chicken leg. If it's a raw chicken leg, you just think that when you finally get down to the chicken leg, that's the bone. But actually, there's a layer of connective tissue over the whole surface of the bone. And that layer is so tightly connected to the bone that it's really, really difficult to separate the periosteum from the bone. And it's attached to the bone using Sharpie's fibers, no relation to the marker person. So here's some Sharpie's fibers, notice how the membrane, which is out here, it kind of actually goes down into the bone. So that's why it's really, really difficult to get that membrane separated from the bone. Okay, so there's a couple of different kinds of bone. The first type that we're going to talk about is compact bone, and it's really, really tightly packed. Um, the uh, the cells are not necessarily right up against each other, but each cell has a little bit of bone tissue surrounding it, and there's like no real spaces in between um, for air to get in there. It makes up most of the diaphysis of the bone, and there's a really thin layer of this compact bone over the epiphyses. This is a great picture of spongy bone, the other type of bone. Notice how it's kind of like honeycombed, or it has like air spaces in there, but compact bone has virtually no spaces. It's just pretty much a solid tissue, mostly. And then spongy bone is not solid at all. Spongy bone is really helpful because compact bone is very heavy. Spongy bone, even though it has some strength, it adds a little bit of lightness to the bone, but still allowing the bone to be strong. Lightens the bone up. If we didn't have spongy bone in the ends of our bones, it would be really, really. We would have much, much huger muscles huger. I don't know what it is. Bigger muscles. There we go. To be able to move our bones around because they'd be much, much heavier. Most of the epiphyses are made out of spongy bone with a little bit of compact bone over the top, just to kind of help it be a smooth surface. In each epiphysis, there's something called an epiphyseal plate. If you are young, it's a zone of cartilage growth in the epiphyses. Really important for growth, because some of the bone, we'll talk about calcification of a bone, how a bone comes into being in another lecture, but this place is a place that the bone can still lengthen but still be structurally sound. The epiphyseal plate is only found in people who are growing. People who are stopped growing, such as myself, that epiphyseal plate, the cartilage, actually gets taken over by bone, and it can't be called an epiphyseal plate because it's not cartilage anymore, and now it's called an epiphyseal line. So that's in people after they have stopped growing. And it's really kind of interesting, this epiphyseal plate, it's very much programmed the order that your bones will stop growing. And even in the bones of your hand, which are still considered long bones, there's a certain order that your hand bones, those epiphyseal plates, will close. When my son was in 4th, 5th grade, he was on monitor for his braces. He was going to have braces, and what they would do every time we went, each year, they take an x-ray of his hand, and I'm like, why are you taking an x-ray of his hand? He needs to have braces. They're like, because that will tell us when the peak of his growth spurt is, because we want to take advantage of that so that he'll be growing at the same time that he has his braces on, so we won't have to do nearly as much. And I'm like, oh, okay, but why his hand? And they said that the bones in the palms of his hand, there's a very specific order that those epiphyseal plates close at, and they know exactly how many, when it looks like some of those are becoming epiphyseal lines, that means that he's like kind of at his peak, and he's gonna be done his growth spurt for a while. So kind of a little interesting fact there. Inside a long bone is something called the medullary cavity. It's a hollow chamber inside the diaphysis, and it makes up most of the diaphysis. Kind of a good thing, because again, it lightens the bone by having a big hollow cavity in there. The endosteum is a layer of cells that line that medullary cavity, and inside there's some marrow. It's soft connective tissue inside the medullary cavity. And depending upon the age of the individual, it could be a couple of different types of marrow. In children, it usually is a red marrow, which is a site of hematopoiesis. We talked about that, red blood cell formation. As people age, it becomes the red marrow gets replaced by yellow marrow, which is just adipose tissue. If you've ever had like a ham steak where they just cut across the femur, in the middle there'll be a bone that's actually a piece of the femur in there, and you can actually see the marrow inside that bone. And supposedly, after the meat has been cooked, that marrow is very sweet and tasty, mostly because you're eating fat. I am not a fan of eating the marrow out of a bone. Microscopic structure of bone, we have some osteocytes, which are bone cells. And as it turns out, there are two types of osteocytes. There are osteoblasts, which are bone builders. Blast B, builders B. Okay, so that's how you remember that. And the other type are osteoclasts, which are bone destroyers. And at any given time in your life, you have different proportions of these. If you're growing, you're going to have more bone builders, osteoblasts, than osteoclasts, but you'll still have some osteoclasts as well. And when you're older and osteoporotic, or maybe just older, you're going to have probably more osteoblasts than osteoclasts. Osteoclasts. You'll have more osteoclasts than osteoblasts. And there's some nice EM picture of some bone cells. Don't look too impressive. This is another diagram that you're going to have to learn for a quiz or a test. Notice this is the compact bone. Notice that you have these tree ring type of structures here. And each of these little dark spots on the tree ring is actually a site where the osteocyte sits. Those little osteocytes sit in a little well called the lacunae. And then you have concentric layers here of these. It's kind of like rings on a tree. And then the central canal here carries a lot of blood vessels and nerves to it. So that, even though bone looks solid, it's mostly solid, but there are canals that are running through the bone. And then here is our periosteum on the outside of the bone. And then we have spongy bone on the inside. So it's kind of interesting. The background picture that you see on this whole PowerPoint is an EM picture that has been of like a longitudinal section of bone. So it would be like this section right here. So let's talk a little bit about these different parts of the bone. We have a Haversian system, or sometimes it's called an osteon. That's the basic unit of bone. That's one of those little tree rings. You have the lacunae, which are the chambers that the osteocytes sit in. Whoops, hello, sorry about that. Then you have caniculi, which are communicating hallways that connect the lacunae to one another because they have to share nutrients, they have to share information between them, and there's not a lot of diffusion going on when you're trying to diffuse something through a solid mass. Then you have lamellae. Those are the concentric circles that contain the lacunae that have the osteocytes. So those are the tree rings, and on each ring of the tree there are some lacunae that have the osteocytes sitting in them. A Haversian canal, or the central canal, is the hallway in the bone that runs usually parallel to the length of the bone, up and down the bone, and that's where the blood vessels and nerves run. And from there are some canals that come out to the side that help to feed the bone. So the Haversian canal is in the middle of each of the Haversian system, and it runs longitudinally in the bone, and the lamellae come out in concentric rings from there until it gets to another central canal, and then there's its ring structure. Volkmann's canals connect the Haversian canals to each other. They run across the bone horizontally. And that's it for this time. Thanks for joining me. Have a great day.